All right, coffee shop nerds. Today is your lucky day because we're going to do something a little bit different on this episode of the podcast. We've invited some big brains to come in here and do a roundtable discussion about technique. But before we get into that and before we introduce our guests, I want to thank Dan and Vince and Evan at California Drums for letting us come and film here. I've known these guys forever. I marched with Vince 35 years ago. We marched together. I'm like looking, this is doing nothing for all the people that are listening on the podcast. I'm looking off screen to these guys, but they've built a really amazing business, small business that I believe that everybody in our community should support because they're the homies and they're also really good at helping you with anything you need, sticks, heads, equipment, instruments, whatever. If you're teaching at a school, if it's for your own personal use, check them out. Either come to this beautiful drum shop in Monrovia or look them up online at cadrums.com. California Drums. So thank you guys. Let's introduce our guests. We'll start over here with Nick Arce. Nick, how's it going?
Good.
How's grad school going?
It's good.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's busy, but I'm hanging out with you guys, so it's nice.
Where
Got time for you guys.
Where are you on staff still officially as far as teaching wise?
RCC.
Okay.
And Blue Devils TBD.
Blue Devils to be determined.
Yeah.
Let's see how things
depending
shake
on
out. It depends on how busy.
availability.
It depends on how busy the guy next to you is.
Yeah, that's right.
Danny Pendergrass, thanks for joining us. Danny is on staff everywhere Nick used to be. You're at Arcadia.
Not anymore. Right now, just at RCC and Blue Devils.
Just at RCC and Blue Devils. So, there's a lot of really great experience happening there. But previously, you also taught at Crossman and
22.
Blue Stars.
Mm-hmm.
Were you teaching anywhere indoor the last couple of years before RCC?
I aged at RCC 22 and then started teaching there in 23.
Okay, got it. So right into it. As soon as Nick made room for you, you were good. You stepped right into that role.
Opt in with him.
Welcome.
And we have Conner Yasuda.
Hey, what's up? Yeah.
Conner is the newly appointed percussion caption head at Mandarin's Drum and Bugle Corps.
Yes, sir.
Congratulations on that. Congratulations on ascending up to that level. Thank you for coming back down to our level for this conversation.
What are you talking about?
But here's the thing. For the last handful of years, you've been on staff at Blue Coats up until this last season, and at Pulse. Two of the really elite programs in the activity, two of the cleanest consistently groups. Maybe not from
we try our best.
Maybe not from your point of view, but I feel like because of that experience and because of the role you played in creating that, you're going to have a lot to add.
Well, I appreciate the kind words.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love hanging with the homies too. So
yeah, we put you here because as soon as you found out what we were going to talk about, we wanted to make sure you couldn't leave.
I'm trapped.
And just for anybody who's missing Rob, Rob is sitting out this conversation because he didn't want to fall asleep on camera. But he will be, he and I are probably going to switch roles because hopefully we'll do another one of these that is more bass drum specific. There's a lot of upper battery energy on the stage here. So we're gonna focus on those aspects. The first question I had for you guys, just to sort of set the table, is when you think about technique as an educator, what role does technique play in how you do things, right? How important is it to you? Is it at the center of your teaching? Is it the most important thing you're teaching? Is it merely a tool? How do you guys think about it personally? We'll start with Nick,
Sure.
if that's okay.
Sure. I think it plays a very big role in my own playing and my own teaching. Probably because that's how I started, just being very aware of my mechanics. And I would say now it's a big part of my teaching because I think there's like a little gap, and it's closing of, talking about technique in playing something better, whether it's to produce a better sound or just execute it rhythmically. And then the other side of this thing is a lot of people will focus just on the listening aspect. And so I like to bring the mechanical side to the conversation so that it's not just about cleaning a book, but about educating the student and making them more conscious of what's going on in their hands. So when those students do inevitably teach, they have a better foundation of why they're doing what they're doing and how to produce the sounds that their groups desire. So,
Okay. Danny, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm on board with a lot of what Nick's talking about. I think the extension I would sort of bring to it is that the reason that I focus on technique is because of the way it affects sound. And that if you're using your technique to produce, if you're focusing so heavily on the mechanical aspects of technique and getting so caught up in that you're not producing good sound, then your technique isn't working for you anyway.
Right.
So the way that I like to think about it is that if you're teaching technique well, it creates better music. And if you're not using technique well, then you're probably not creating very good music. I've seen a lot of people that use, they have kind of their own developed technique and they sound really, really good. The difficulty with that is sometimes what works really well for somebody to produce good sound on their own is hard to teach to a group of like 8 or 9 snare drummers.
Yeah.
So for me, the uniformity aspect of teaching technique has to do with how can we make this information as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, just so that we're on the same page about the kind of sound we want to create and then the physical aspect of how we're going to produce that sound. Not necessarily everybody just doing the best thing for them or whatever works for them, because a lot of times you don't really have enough time in a season for everybody to figure out that best way that works for them.
Sure. I'm going to ask you, I'm going to throw a curveball at you right away. You mentioned producing a good sound. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it is subjective, of course. I think everybody has a little bit of a different taste on what they think is a good sound.
So is it a taste thing?
I think somewhat, but I think there is almost a cutoff point of if you're choking off the sound of the stick and over squeezing, that's both going to affect your technique and efficiency, and also it's going to keep your sound from projecting as much.
Okay.
So most of the time, especially in drum corps, where we're trying to produce a sound that's going to make it up to the box of a football stadium, we need to be producing, getting the most bang for our buck out of our sound. That doesn't necessarily mean the loudest at all times, but it does mean a sound that's resonant in tone, where we're not choking off any vibration or resonance of the stick or of the drum itself. Not that we have that much control after we strike the head. But I think there's something that when I am focusing on sound, something that I'll use a lot with students is a lot of times we think about drums as being such an articulate instrument that we don't have any control over duration. So this might be more of like a psychological tool, but I think it does work in allowing people to open up their sound a little bit, is think of producing the full note value of whatever note it is you're playing. So if you're playing eighth notes, it's not the same thing as a 32nd note followed by a dotted 16th note rest. It's an eighth note, and we want to hear more of a da sound rather than just short attack. I think that's mostly how I would quantify good versus bad sound is the stick vibrating fully? Are you moving air through the drum to where the shell vibrates?
And that's it for today's podcast. We've covered everything. You said all the words: efficiency, resonance,
all the buzzwords.
all the buzzwords. But that was great, and we'll dig in a little bit more. Conner, how big of a role does technique play in your personal teaching and getting the results you do?
I agree with these guys fully. I think that the technique is the factor. These are the things you talk about to achieve your end goal, which is what Danny mentioned. Like, you want a resonant tone, something that's full and exactly how you said, will reach the top of the box and translate across a large distance, be it outdoor or indoor. And so throw a couple things on top of that too. Like, you want technique that will aid in like solid rhythmic integrity. It'll give you the tools to blend balance and play with the person next to you, as well as provide you with a solid like presence behind the drums. And I talk about that all the time with all the groups I've ever worked with. Is like, can you achieve those main goals? Can you, the comments and the feedback that you get based on technique are there to help facilitate what those end goals are. But on the flip side of that, like, everyone's hands are shaped differently. Everyone's got different muscles, different groupings. People have long fingers, people have short fingers, can barely hold the stick or have to do some weird thing to make sure they can turn the wrist or stuff like that. And to get everyone as close as possible to the same technique where you can now feed comments that apply to a wide range of people, that is what you are assembling when you talk about like, this wrist turn happens here or your fulcrum sits here or something like that. So basically creating the language that everyone can understand super quick, because when you get in the season, you have maybe 5 seconds between a rep to say, hey, grip here, grip tighter, loosen up here, find the resonant tone, all that stuff. Like, you don't have an hour to explain why you need to do something. But so long as you structured, the weeks or rehearsals leading up until that point, everyone understands the same language and is born and bred from the same quote unquote technique, where you can make those fixes like super fast.
Yeah. So when you get into the practical, like boots on the ground, having to do what you're talking about, which is, being able to make something better, improve something, correct it, however you want to put it, really fast in the short amount of time that you have before they reset. Is it technique comments? Like, do you find yourself saying, do this specifically technique wise, or is it a thought that triggers that's like founded, that has like a foundation in technique? How do you, and does the time of the season matter?
Yeah, I think that's a huge thing. Is like, well, everyone wants to nerd out about one tiny little detail and spend 30 minutes talking about it. Does that mean that's going to take 30 minutes away from you saying you need to finish this chunk by the end of the block so that we can play it with the tenors or with the basses or with the pit or something like that? Like, you are on the clock. You got to make sure that you're getting that information out there fast as possible. But I think that like the how you put it, like when during the season does that matter? Hopefully by the time you get to Dayton and you're not making these grand changes, you're not making huge like leaps and bounds in terms of information. Hopefully by that time, everyone can understand when you say like, a little keyword or a reminder, or you say like, hey, remember how we played this part of the exercise, or how we play taps in the first section of the exercise? Look for that feeling on this chunk of the music. And that's language that they can all pick up on because they've been doing that for, months before.
With the groups that you guys have worked with, establishing that foundation, that vocabulary, those, when they say this to us, we know that it means these certain things. Is that like an early season, like that's when that gets established, when you first have the group in front of you and you're saying, okay, this is the sandbox that we're playing in. This is what this means. This is what that means. How foundational do you get? Because you guys are teaching at a high level, right? A lot of people maybe would be surprised just how foundational high-level groups get. At RCC and Blue Devils, like, do they do that? Do they get back to like, okay, this is how we're going to move on taps. These are twitch strokes. This is how we're going to upstroke. Like, do you guys get that detailed about everything?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the beginning training portion of the season is super vital to be able to make everything else fluid and efficient when you're like in mid Texas and it's hot and you're moving quick and don't get as many reps. It's like, what are those trigger words that help the students get back into what they've trained already? So yeah, I think we do those very, very basic fundamentals. I think maybe over the last, maybe like 8 years, it's been very skill set driven. So not just let's play the basic exercises, but let's really hone in on what those skill sets are. Like,
And so when you say skill set,
yeah, let's talk about it, because there's a difference to me between rudiments and skill sets.
Okay.
Like a lot of students or a lot of groups will play, they'll go through the rudiments, and the way I like to see it is like on a matrix, and where top line, left to right, it's all the things, all the what you're learning, all these rudiments. Oh, now I learned this rudiment and this cool hybrid rudiment that kid just named yesterday, and rather than just spending time on like the first 5 of those basic things like legato strokes and accent tap and then some doubles and triples and digging deep into those. So you're playing with duration of whatever it is that you're playing with height, and you're playing with tempo, and putting those in different contexts. And those are the skills. Like if we think of a flam drag, there's different skills within that rudiment.
Right.
And I think we cloud what we think about by thinking rudimentally and not by a skill set, and how those are applicable to many things that we play. And so I like to focus on what those skill sets are, like starting basic, of course, and then getting to what we know is going to be in the book. Say for Blue Devils, I glide write some pretty crazy stuff, and so we can anticipate specific shifts and specific skills that are always going to pop up, and they have been like the issues over the years. Like, okay, let's focus on this thing. Let's make a primer that's not just a rhythmic primer, or not just like specific to whatever that height is. Like, let's make a skill set primer so you learn the sensations, and back to closing that gap of what it sounds like and what it feels like, or technically what you're doing. It's like, we want you to do this mechanically, so we produce this sound. Now when you hear that sound, what's the sensation? So that when you're in, again, mid-season, you're given an ear comment like, let's listen to this. They're going back and falling back on the sensations of what that felt like to produce that. So
do you feel like taking that path, right, of thinking of skill sets as like a layer that we're sort of adding to the technique / approach conversation, is that because it's the right thing to do and the best thing to do, or is that what you've needed to do? Because you sort of alluded to it.
Yeah.
Is that because you've taught at Blue Devils and RCC, and you've realized that focusing on those things makes the season, it better prepares you to be able to navigate the season? Or do you just think this is the best way to go about it?
I think we've had to do that.
Yeah.
Like, we've had to learn these skill sets and try and make what has been physically difficult as efficient as possible. And in that process, like, oh, we could think about it this way or physically do it this way. And so that became like the center piece of what we taught.
Yeah.
Rather than like learn this book and do it and listen in and don't be slow. And then you have a byproduct of like all these different tendencies in the snare line. So I think focusing, like reverse engineering, focusing on those skill sets that tend to come up first, and then building all the other things onto that.
Danny, you went through that process of learning that way, and now you teach that way, presumably, or teach some version of that moving forward. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just think what Nick described, he's used this word a few times, of sensations. I think being able to recreate sensations from one context to another is a lot. When people talk about certain parts of the book that will clean themselves, I think a lot of times that's what they're referring to, is that if you take a whole phrase that's made up of just a bunch of paradiddle variations, it's likely that it's not that rudiment has been so practiced that now we can throw different patterns in and have it still be clean. It's if a line has mastery over the skill sets that are used in playing paradiddle phrases, then they're going to be able to apply that, whether it's a 6-tuplet paradiddle phrase at 140 or a 16th note paradiddle phrase at 210, right? Where you can change the context musically, but physically you're producing the same feeling. So if you can build those connections across different parts of the show, now you've taken this part of the show that maybe you work all the time that's in the drum feature, and you've also, not actively by working on the closer, but you've cleaned some of the closer too, because these sensations are recreated. But I feel like holds a lot of younger players back is the inability to move from one context to another and recognize to kind of do that rhythmic math of if you're playing eighth notes at this tempo, it's triplets at this tempo. And if you can't produce the same feeling of rebound off the head, then you're producing a different sound for different rhythms that are the same hand speed. Mm-hmm. So I think it's, with Nick's point of breaking down those, like looking past the rudiment, I almost see it as you have, the highest level is the music that you're playing. So it's like the book or the exercise. And then the next level down would be the rudiments. And then the next level below that is where the skill sets lie. What I've found with teaching is the skill sets are really hard to focus on if there's no coordination built through some of the rudiment stuff first. So that's why I think some of the classic breakdown exercises still work really well if you're teaching like middle school and high school students. Yeah. And if students have that foundation and now they're at a place like RCC or Blue Devils or Pulse or Coates, at that kind of level, that sensation has already been built, and then they can bring attention to certain aspects of it. Mm-hmm. That's what I think I felt at Blue Devils that I gained from Nick's teaching and from Regwa's teaching when I was at RCC as well. And then Sean Clark also. It's just having more awareness of, okay, well, this is what a flam accent feels like. Now I can focus on what the right hand does. If I couldn't play flam accents already, it doesn't really matter how much I tell a student, or if I can't do it, it doesn't matter how much I'm told to focus on an aspect of it. Yeah. I'm not going to be able to do that if I'm in survival mode. So I would echo like pretty much everything that Nick said with that maybe addition to it, that if there's no coordination of that middle level to begin with, it's going to be tough to dig deeper into the skill sets. But the skill sets might help to universalize what you're doing.
I tried that with a young student before.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
Like, let's try this backwards method. It works with older students because they've already had that experience. And in lessons, I definitely try, like, let's try a skill set first. And then once they play that skill set, let's say, hey, that's called a flam accent, or that's called a flam tap. And it worked for some things, but not for all. So I do agree, like, the coordination aspect and the simplicity of learning, like, hey, this is just that one rudiment. It does simplify that whole process, and then you can kind of just build on that for more advanced stuff.
So there's something that I've talked about in casual conversation a lot, but given that I've mostly been an observer of you guys teaching and the groups that you've taught, something that really struck me was the scalability of how you're teaching. What you're talking about is, does it scale down? Like, it works with more experienced players who have a certain, they've achieved a certain level, they've done a certain amount of work already, right? But trying to make it work for that younger, maybe beginner student, does what you guys are talking about, does that change at all? I mean, because you guys have had to teach people from scratch, quote unquote, like at the high school level at least, right? Does that change how you teach a lot in terms of like approach, technique, skill sets? Or do you find you don't have to change a whole lot? Is it just the material, the level of the material that's changing? What about you, Nick?
I'd say the material changes.
Okay.
Like, it's not going to be a ton of like the shifts that I might give to Blue Devil guys or RCC guys. But I think the philosophy behind it, in terms of like, let them play some stuff and then have a discussion around it of why they're doing it and making those connections between what they hear and what they feel. Mm-hmm. I think those conversations are still had, but it's not like digging in. It also depends on their level and how much feedback they give. Like, okay, they can handle this. Like, they want to take this further. Like, let's continue. And I think you can only do that in lesson settings. I think when you're working with like a high school group or a middle school group, that's very different. Like, you definitely have to scale back and be more global in that sense, because there's going to be students who won't understand that philosophical approach first. But I try and do it and see where they're at and then adapt from there. Yeah.
So the scalability question is something when I look at the way sort of RCC and Blue Devils have done it, at least from the outside, the way Pulse has taught, and what I see as sort of like, at least again from the outside, what looks to be a general sort of philosophy and picture, I do see that as being very scalable. Mm-hmm. The reason why, because here in Southern California, a lot of when you can tell when a former Pulse slash somebody who's been in the Box 6 system, when they go and teach at a school, you're like, yeah,
Right,
you know,
yeah.
and there does seem to be like an A-class version of it, right? It's not just a world-class thing. There is and funny enough, like on Box 6's website, you can buy a world-class,
Right.
open class, A-class version. Can you talk about essentially how Pulse and maybe even how Bluecoats has done what they were sort of alluding to, but like your version?
Yeah, I think that I mean, like you guys mentioned, it's able to be scaled from like the novice drummer to the experienced drummer because by nature the books that we play are built of rudiments, which are built of those skill sets. Those are our building blocks. Those are the things that we assemble together. So long as we're working on, basic skill sets like how to play a full sounding triplet roll or how to play legato strokes that are consistent in time, how does that affect your dynamic contrast, stuff like that. Like the novice drummer will use that to play, their books. And as soon as you take a look at the open class version or the world class version, when you really look down to it, it's like, well, the same skill sets are still there, but there's more, it's faster, or there's choppier parts attached to those same skill sets. Maybe there's switches in rhythm that are, the skill sets that you are building, using those like basic concepts can be elevated. And I do think it is kind of in the name of like, what does the music call for? What are those things that you need to be practicing, and what are the how can you boil every single hard piece of the music down to its basic skill sets? I've heard this story about one of my old instructors, Jeremy Riley, when he was learning how to play. He had this idea. It's like, well, what if I take like 3, it's like, well, let me do double stops. Let me start off same. It's like, I'm like, this is cool. This is a cool sound. And he's like, oh, I just made plan taps. That's all it was. It's like every single rudiment was boiled down to an individual hand, an individual set of notes. And the more that you can layer that down onto it, it's like everything is really just those little itty bitty things kind of put on top of each other.
Yeah.
So going from, the novice to the experience, it's just like, well, maybe I layered 4 more things on top of that as opposed to the basic, I was playing 8 on the hand in the get-go.
Yeah. And it's almost like it's a way to take these things that on the face of it can feel really complicated and really like overwhelming to tackle, and breaking it down into its like component parts, and parts that then can be switched out and moved to other things. At RCC and Blue Devils, there's this culture of like, well, at least in terms of my experience, again, from watching you guys from the outside, this is the first time I'd ever heard of people doing primers. When I marched, we basically would play like check patterns. That would be our version of playing primers to get like hand speed or something like that. But super basic question: why do you guys do that, or why do you think you guys do that at RCC and Blue Devils? Is it out of necessity because the parts have traditionally been so complex, or is it just like we really like this method? And what does that even mean?
Yeah.
In terms of like constructing a primer?
I think so. I don't know where this started. My guess is like Regwa probably doing a bunch of primers where he changed it. Just that is the traditional, like what you would assume a primer is, to prime you for the actual part. You're gonna take something away, and that would be the check pattern. I think over the years it's changed into like, let's make a mini exercise out of it.
So like there's like a progression.
Yeah, there can be a progression, and the utility kind of changes for me. Like I don't just like to play like the skeleton or the check. I like to make primers that are not just rhythmic focused. Like let's make one that's sensation focused. Like let's focus on where the intensity. Like if you're playing a part that's not going well as a group, like check out what each hand's doing and where intensity lies, and it's usually going to be the issue. And so I like to isolate that intensity and then layer that other hand, because usually they're opposite intensities or varying intensities that overlap. That's coordination based. So
I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit.
Oh.
For people who don't, who that feels a little bit elusive in terms of understanding that.
Yeah.
Can you think of something really specific where you've broken it down, where you've had to break it down that way into being more of a sensation thing and coordination
Think of
thing?
the independent stuff?
No.
You
I
looked
have,
at me
I have
with
a
like a-
specific. I have
ahead.
one in mind.
Okay, go ahead.
It's not a book thing, but it's the section of Morris Spree. There's the 16th notes at the end. That the I don't know if the rudiment has a name, but it's accented right diddle and then a left accent and then 2 right flams and then a left tap. And so this is the reason this came to mind is because it's a way that we were breaking it down a few years ago. So in 2022 at RCC, we had a lot of members that were new to RCC but had a lot of experience. And so when I approached the section to break it down in a certain way, that was kind of in my mind how I thought Nick would do it, but not necessarily the conventional way of doing it. Conventional way would be like, all right, let's take out that diddle, let's take out the flams. So now the sticking we end up with would be right, left, right, right, left, because those 2 flams are on the right, and then you take out that first diddle and you end up with a single right hand. But the way that I approached it instead was what it feels like you're playing is a single right hand attack and then a left 4. So it would be right, left, 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 left is the real skeleton in terms of sensation.
Okay.
If you were to take out the left hand throw that produces those 4 notes and just play a paradiddle, now you have a different sensation in the left hand from what you would actually be producing when you're playing the part. So the sort of order of operations there was something like playing a 5-note grouping where there's 1 right and then 4 lefts, and then throwing in the diddle on that first accent, and that's just kind of a rhythmic addition, but also a slight feel change, different intensity hand to hand, but you keep the left hand 4, and then adding the 2 notes for the right hand flams later on that layer in with the left hand 4 as it's continuing. What I noticed a lot is when people would mess up that rudiment, is there would be a disruption in flow of that left hand. So this is something I like to do sometimes. I would do this with my own practice videos, but you can do it just watching a video of anybody drumming, is zoom in to where you can only see one hand at a time and see if their motion is consistent or if there's like a block in their flow in a part where they need to continue moving.
What does that mean?
So
that people know, like, if they're actually going to do that, like what they need to look for.
So a lot of times in that particular rudiment, which I'm sure you can find the music for Morris Spree and break it down for yourself. If that left hand 4 is not consistent and doesn't flow, you're going to see the beads stop somewhere in the motion of those 4 notes instead of continuing to bounce through all 4 of them. Yeah. So if that flow stops, then you're making it way harder on yourself both to produce a smooth sound and to continue a consistent rhythm, right? It just kind of doesn't make any sense. If you're walking down the street and then all of a sudden you'd stop your right foot from moving, but you're trying to walk at the same speed, like you just made it way harder for yourself to achieve that. When you could just focus on being smooth, and then if you focus on being smooth, you don't necessarily have to think about taking even steps.
Yeah.
You just have sort of constant momentum. And I think a lot of times when we insert something like a right flam after a left-handed accent, we don't view the grace note as being a part of the motion that was started with the left attack before it. So yeah, the goal of it is preserving the feeling of fluidity, which is what allows you to play stuff faster.
Right. You guys are no stranger to primers and to whatever you guys call them.
Yeah.
Progressions. We see you in the lot all the time, working through like, okay, they're going to work on this part and they play it this way, then this way, then this way, and then ultimately it's the part.
Yeah.
And your job a lot of the times is to guide them through that. Is there any sort of logic or philosophy specific to the groups you've taught at that guide that? Or is it just like the way you were taught? Or
Yeah, at least for me, I use like the term like primer or check or, starter like interchangeably. I think that there is like a use
Starter's
for
interesting.
everything.
Yeah, I've heard.
Yeah,
I don't either.
I think of it more as like, what is the skill set that they are lacking in proficiency?
Okay.
Does it have something to do with like fluidity, or does it have something to do with rhythmic interpretation, or are they not able to play the heights properly and visibly see where the deficiency is? I think in terms of that, like that's an awesome way to break something down. You're not playing the skeleton, but rather you're mimicking the sensation. And like that, at least in my mind, like when I had to learn how to play like what's it called, a blue cheese 5. That was Roger's, put it on the website. I didn't think about playing it super slow and matching all the heights and stuff like that. I took what hand was prominent and I put that at the back end of my exercise. So that way, when it was time to put it all together at the very end and play the rudiment as it was written, I had worked my way up into finding the sensation of the heights, then matching the sensation between the more difficult part, because that felt closer to the end goal. So I was working through sensation because I was lacking fluidity and I wasn't able to get my 6 moving in a constant flow. But on other parts where it's like, hey, these guys know how to play a paradiddle with a lot of good motion. They can get it with solid heights, but the paradiddle's a 5-lit, or it's written as a 5-lit. So I wouldn't necessarily try and play a paradiddle slow and then work it through, because I'm not trying to develop smoothness or fluidity with my hands, or teaching them to develop fluidity. I'm trying to get them to play the 5-lit in time. So that's a point where I would say, like, all right, if you were to play the check and you took out the herta and you took out all the inner diddles, can you make that 5-lit start on 1, end on 3, and can you replicate that a bunch of times through? So that way, when it is time to layer all those diddles on top, the sensation's different, but we've just spent 8 months playing paradiddles, so I can trust that they can, pop it out on the fly. But what they've gained in the time working that primer is developing the 5-lit timing consistently.
Okay.
And in a part where I think that is the higher priority, that's how I would go about breaking down those things.
Is it different, like what you have to do specifically when it comes to everything you just described? Is that different at Blue Coats than it is at Pulse? Is there anything you had to adjust? And if so, why?
I wouldn't say a lot I have to adjust, mostly just because my teaching style is the same. I'm not going to change based on what group. I've been lucky to have like a lot of time to myself. If I'm doing a subs block or anything like that, it's like, hey, like we're going to do it my way because my way is the way I know the best how to teach, and I was brought on for this reason. So I'm not going to try and do like a version of someone else's technique, because it's just going to be diluted, or their teaching style or stuff like that. So I would go about doing it the way that I feel the most comfortable and the way that I believe gets results super quickly.
I would wager to guess you're pretty confident in like the results that you can get, and feeling like, because there's something to be said for the conviction to which you engage in trying to solve something like that. Danny, you and I had a conversation recently where we were talking about how things were going at RCC, and you talked about being open, right? And adapting to the kids that you have.
Yeah.
Right. There is a fine line between being open and being inconsistent.
Sure.
And there's also a fine line with having a lot of conviction about what you're going to teach and how, and being stubborn and sort of stuck, right? Where are you guys with that? Like, do you guys feel like this is the way I teach? I have my methods. I've tested them over the years, and everything is just a little refinement? Or are you still like discovering, ways to improve stuff? What about you, Danny? I'll start with you.
Definitely still discovering, but I don't think that's I think I've gotten less dogmatic over time with what I think is essential for technique or sound production or whatever.
Yeah.
Just because I've seen, one of the things that opened my eyes to that was doing the marching vlogs drumline in 2020.
I was going to talk about that.
Where we had this huge mix. I mean, these guys were both there too on the other side of it. I was in it. But we had this huge mix of like players with very different backgrounds, all at a pretty similar skill level, all like sort of in the top 3 SoCal WGI groups.
Yeah.
So we played differently from each other, but when we played together, it sounded great.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of, I think that wasn't, it was sort of confirmation of a thought I had been having around that time, where I was like, I don't know if the things that we get in arguments about are really that big of a deal.
Right.
And that's where, when Conner was talking just now, what I just kept thinking is all of this stuff is just context dependent. It depends on the book that they're being asked to play, depends on how you tune the drums, what heads you're using, what their visual responsibilities are, and who the students themselves are, their level of experience, how similar or different they are to each other when they make the line. So I think that's what's led to me being less assertive about this is the way to do it, or this is how RCC does it, or this is how Blue Devils does it. It always comes down to who's in the line and what are they being asked to do. And how can I adapt the few universal concepts that I understand or I've cultivated through the people that have taught me and things that I've found have worked through my individual experience. How can we kind of mesh those worlds and try to find the best fit to create the cleanest product we can?
I'm glad you brought that up because, and I remember the Marching Vlogs drumline being I remember you being like, I'm really having an experience here. Like you had to play next to Zach Borromeo, and it's like seeing people like Zach Wilson and Zach Romeo in the lot versus having to play clean with them in the line. Very different sort of experience, and that was and for people who don't know, that was a thing that Sergio Bravo put together for SoCal area marching percussionists during COVID. It was a way for us to get together and raise a little money for the community, but just get a little bit back of what we were missing. But a nice byproduct of that was you had a bunch of people coming together that all, on the face of it, played differently, whatever that means, right? But what if you gave them all the same thing to play? What would happen, And I think that was, for everybody that was in the line, that was probably a very, everybody had their own sort of mini epiphanies during that. And I can see why that would make you a little bit less, as you described it, dogmatic. Let's talk about that a little bit. Sort of shift gears in terms of how to think about technique a little bit. We zoomed in. Let's zoom out a little bit. When people think about technique being good or bad, right or wrong, that can be because of a lot of different reasons, right? There are a lot in this activity. There are so many ensembles that basically execute at the highest level, right? And from the outside, it really seems like they all drum differently. And maybe that's not as much the case. Maybe it's what they're being asked to drum is so different that it's creating this thing that you sort of see from the outside. Is there a danger? What is the danger of being dogmatic, though? Because without naming names, I'm sure we can think of people and groups that are really amazing teachers, get really incredible results, and are hyper dogmatic in the way they teach. They've taught that way for 20 years, 30 years, and it's always clean. It's always really good. What are the pros and cons of that? Anybody?
I would say that you are sacrificing the ability to become a more well-rounded drummer or person, to take in information from all sides as to kind of, parse it out, see what works, and you can apply it on yourself. But I think that if you are saying, I'm only going to be following this one method, as a student saying, I'm only going to be following this one method, this one trajectory, and I'm gonna follow that until like the day I die. That is the way I'm going to age out. That's the way I'm gonna teach.
Because like
all that
maybe
stuff. It's
like maybe you won gold medals, maybe
Yeah.
you won Sanford's, right? And you're like, well, that worked. That was best in the world that year. Why can't we just keep? What is the danger of just like?
Yeah.
Why can't we just keep doing that? You know?
I think it's definitely a bit of a time bomb kind of conversation, because I agree. I do think that there are techniques that are like, hey, they've got a lot of golds doing this thing. They got a lot of Sanfords. Like, why doesn't everyone do that? You know, but at least in my mind, the way I think of it is like, if you want to experience another group, you don't want to be caught in this corner that you can't step out of. You don't want to say, I've only got the technique of this one group, and they teach it so harshly, and they say like, this is right, this is wrong. It's binary. There's finite like truths and you know, things that you can and can't do. As soon as you say like, well, I kind of want to check out this other group because I like the music they play, or I like the way their organizations run, or I just like their style or something like that. All of a sudden, you know, you've only been taught to play one way. How are you expected to expand your bank of knowledge if you've only been in a group for, you know, one reason only? And I think that that's also on the side of the instructor too. Like, you owe it to the student to not only learn to play this one book for this 1 year and get really good at 8 minutes of music, or 12 minutes for outdoor. Like, you want them to be a better percussionist. You want to teach them the skill sets and the rudiments and the building blocks, so that way they can take that to wherever group or whatever show they play next.